So I'm just going to ask all the panelists, if you can, for the time being, mute yourself. And we will, when you're up, we will be in touch. But for right now, I want to begin. I'm grateful and actually very emotional being here. My name's Jonathan Feldstein. I'm the great grandson of Shalom Yaakov and Drezel Birnbach, who were murdered along with their children, grandchildren, siblings, nieces, and nephews 80 years ago today. And I'm the grandson of Miriam Birnbach Feldstein, who was born in Kanczuga and was gratefully able to flee Poland in the 1930s. I'm here because my great-grandparents had the foresight and good fortune to get 4 of their children out of Poland any way possible before it was too late. We pronounce it in different ways, Kanczuga and Kanczuga, but it's a common thread in all of our respective families' DNA. Borrowing another phrase, to a degree at least, it's true that you can take the Jews out of Kanczuga, but you can't take Kanczuga out of the Jews. At least let that be the case today. None of us have ever lived there, yet many of us who are descendants of the small Jewish community of Kanczuga have familial and nostalgic connections, even if those are negative, of persecution and of murder. It's an important part of who we are and where we came from. As part of our family's diaspora, they ended up in Kanczuga, and many of our relatives' lives ended there. It's also important to remember today as a microcosm of the vastness of the murder of 6 million Jews, a number that still is too incomprehensible. My family alone represented just a few dozen of the 6 million. Kanczuga was one small village of some 1,000 Jews. When you divide 6 million individuals by a few dozen, representing each of our families, or divide by 1,000, representing the entire lost communities, it makes the magnitude of 6 million that much more relatable, the sum of hundreds of thousands of families like each of ours, and communities like Kanczuga, destroyed. We're here to remember the end of Jewish life in Kanczuga as it was 80 years ago today, but we're also here to honor the survivors, their struggles, the rebuilding of their lives, and because of whom we are each here today. Throughout my life, almost everywhere I've lived, I've encountered the Jews from Kanczuga. It's quite astounding. Of course, I remember my grandmother. And my great aunt, my great uncle, who I recall fondly. They were part of my life from my earliest recollections. I remember as a child going with my father to Kanczuga Society events, the Landsmannschaft communal group, where survivors and their children would visit, reminisce, and look out for one another. My father always seemed in his prime among these people who he knew as a young man and among whom he felt at home like family. He passed that on to me. There's a legend that my great-grandfather was one of the founders of the first Kanczuga Society in America over 120 years ago. But sadly, he went back to Poland, where while trying to get his family out, in the end, he and most of the family perished. My father got one of his first jobs after immigrating to the US due to a relationship from someone from Kanczuga. As a young adult myself, I remember the sense of kinship at these meetings. Shortly after moving to Teaneck, New Jersey, I'll never forget praying in the basement of a neighbor one evening and overhearing some men speaking in Yiddish, not understanding a word except for one, Kanczuga. Walking home 2 blocks that night, I related this to my friend and neighbor, Danny Clapper, who literally lived 3 houses away. I thought he was joking when he responded that he was telling me who he knew I was speaking about and that man's relationship to Kanczuga as the descendant of the former rabbi, and that Danny's family was also from there. It was literally too unbelievable, and I thought he was joking. Then I discovered that several other neighbors in Teaneck were also descendants of the Jewish community of Kanczuga. Later on, in our experiment with Amway, we got to know Morris Chariton. One day on a visit with some of the elders at the Kanczuga Society meeting, I discovered that Morris's own father was also from Kanczuga. I remember speaking with Willie Cranberg and Bernie Schanzer, each of them telling me their personal stories of their lives and survival. Willie would tell me the details of the pogrom that took place in Kanczuga, where 7 Jews were murdered by their Polish neighbors after the war had ended. He would preface it by saying that he wouldn't sleep for 3 days, but he'd tell me. Just as I knew that Willie was one of the young men who buried the victims of that pogrom in April 1945, I remember being at his funeral, showing him the final respect that he so deserved and which he showed to several other of his former friends and neighbors decades earlier. Bernie once shared with me that it was my great-grandmother who saved his life. As they were being deported on that horrible day 80 years ago, she said to him, "You're too young." He understood and he fled. That moment is documented in the book Hidden by Leo Rosen and Faye Walker, just his escape. But because of that conversation, now we know the backstory. When we moved to Israel, I was given a piece of paper with a name and a phone number and my instructions to connect with Yehuda Ehrlich. This was a letter of introduction, as someone would do from one distant relative to another, and which I suspected many carried when they left Europe. Yehuda and I met, and he met and spoke with my children before their trips to Poland, sharing his harrowing stories with warmth. Then we learned his son, David, and I had another connection, with David having taught at Emory a few years after I graduated. I didn't know him then, but got to know him through visits to his famous Jerusalem restaurant, Tmol Shilshom. Each visit with David was like catching up with a relative and good friend. Years later, he learned that my daughter and son-in-law went to Tmol Shilshom on one of their first dates. David invited them to come back to be his guest, just like a relative would do for one another. Sadly, David died just about 2.5 years ago. Everyone who remembers him fondly. Before that, after moving to Israel, my wife went out with a friend, Hindi Snow, to Yad Vashem. When approaching the Valley of the Lost Communities, they discovered that Hindi's family is also from Kanczuga. And of course, I knew her aunt, Esther Ziskind, who is the perennial backbone of the first Kanczuga Society, from before I was its president in the 1990s and since. Hindi and her husband, Chaim, remain friends, appropriately with Chaim being behind the camera, capturing video of many of our family's celebrations and life cycle events here in Israel, things that my great-grandparents could only dream about. As new immigrants in Israel, we made lots of new friends. Yossi Sawson, who unlike Danny Clapper and Teaneck, living 3 houses away, lived only 2 houses away. And how improbable, but now already normal in our lives, learning that his family was also from Kanczuga. And if that's not close enough, when our children were little, they played together and had sleepovers at one another's homes. I don't know it for sure, but I have an instinct that things were not all that different with our children playing together like that in Kanczuga. And sometime later in Israel, we received a call from Rabbi David Weinbach, who came to visit. He remembered Kanczuga as a child and volunteered to share a family tree of mine that he had done. He was so thoughtful as he narrated the details about my family with me. And then in a serious moment, he tried to explain that many of my relatives had children before they were married, at least according to the official records of Kanczuga. Clearly, they had a Jewish wedding sometime before, but for some reason that I'm yet to be able to understand, only later registered their marriage civilly. Most unusual was that my own grandparents' wedding was registered in Kanczuga 2 years after they made Aliyah. I don't understand why that was, but with his great sensitivity, Rabbi Weinbach was afraid that I would think of my relatives as swingers or something of that sort, and he wanted to be sure that I understood. I didn't think that, but so appreciated his warmth and concern. In general, but because he was as kind as he was, it was a great excitement and pleasure to connect Rabbi Weinbach with Yehuda Ehrlich, reuniting cousins after some 70 years, and that they had been able to reestablish a relationship interrupted as children. And then there was a chance connection to Michael Freund. In 2008, I happened to be reading an article in the Jerusalem Post and saw an article of his about Poland, drawing my interest. I won't steal his thunder, but suffice it to say that I was astounded to read that his family also came from Kanczuga. That led to our connecting, becoming friends, and discovering that he went to Princeton, where I grew up. We share many common values and visions, and it was as a result of a visit together a few months ago that we realized we couldn't let today's 80th anniversary of the massacre of our relatives go unrecognized. So today, we mourn our relatives and their neighbors who lived and raised their children together in this small Polish shtetl and who were murdered together 80 years ago. We celebrate the courage and fortitude of those who survived and rebuilt their lives, and those who had already established themselves in Israel and in the US, where they helped those who would follow later to set up their new lives and rebuild remnants of a community that had been their home, if only because of the shared kinship of once being neighbors. I want to thank Michael for partnering with me to organize this memorial event, and for all of you for joining us. Unfortunately, at the last minute, Michael was called out of town and is unable to join us. We'll miss him here, but are grateful for his help in making this possible. He especially wanted to remember his relative, Aharon Freund, who was murdered by the Germans and about whom he wrote in the Jerusalem Post, and we will compile the link to that along with other sources for you after this event. Today, we're an extended group of descendants of the Jewish community from Kanczuga and other Jews and Christians with no particular connection to Kanczuga, but who want to be part of this event, people of conscience who join us in a personal memorial of the destruction of one of the thousands of Jewish communities throughout Europe. We would be remiss, partly because of the number of Christians who have joined us today, not to note that there are several people and families recognized as righteous Gentiles, credited with saving the Jews from Kanczuga despite a grave personal threat to them, and because of whom many of us are here today. Speaking of righteous Gentiles, many of us have connected and even met a young Polish man, Patrick, who has diligently reached out to many of the descendants of the Jewish community of Kanczuga, the town in which he grew up, seeking to recreate a sense of the vibrant history of what was once a thriving Jewish community about which many Poles don't know, and in some way create reconciliation between Poles and Jews. Patrick has also spearheaded the cleaning up of the Jewish cemetery, for which we should all be grateful. Arguably, he's gone out of his way to acquire memorabilia and relate the history of the Jews of Kanczuga more than anyone in the past 8 decades, with the possible exception of Yad Vashem. In a small way, I feel that if my great-grandparents could see us all now, they'd be thrilled that we're remembering them, that we're remembering their relatives and all your relatives, and that we're connecting with one another 8 decades later as their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and those of their friends and neighbors who perished with them. I pray that this is a suitable memorial to each of our relatives and all of their neighbors who were murdered 80 years ago, and to those who fell victim before that and during the pogrom that took place after the war in April 1945. At this season, where we take account of our past and annul vows that we've made but not fulfilled, let us take a vow together to never forget. I'd like to pass the conversation on to Rabbi Shalom Carmi. Rabbi Carmi is professor of philosophy and Jewish studies at Yeshiva University. He's editor emeritus of Tradition and a contributing editor at First Things, and has published hundreds of articles in a variety of areas and edited 2 volumes of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's manuscripts. By full disclosure, I know him as my father's first cousin. At YU, he is also known as one of the most respected and accessible faculty members, as evidenced by the long-term relationships he has with his fellow students. Rabbi Carmi, you just need to unmute yourself. There we go.
Okay. Full name is Shalom Yaakov Carmi, the grandson of Shalom Yaakov Bernbach. My mother was Chaya, or Helen Carmi, and she was among people who knew her all the way back as Lucia. My grandmother, as Jonathan already mentioned, did everything to ensure that as many of her children as possible would escape in time. 4 of them did. Uncle Harry in the 1920s, Nat Bernbach, Miriam Feldstein, Jonathan's grandmother, and my mother later on. My grandparents and the other 4 children and their descendants did not escape. Were killed either during the war or immediately after the war. In the last days, I've reread a short story by Shmuel Yosef Agnon called Hasiman. There are 2 stories called Hasiman. I'm referring to the one that's one of them. Agnon's town, Buchach, was well to the east of Kanczuga, Ruthenian-speaking area. In the second version of Hasiman, he describes a fictional figure who is himself on the day before Shavuot, receiving word that the entire community was liquidated. It's all over. Goes home, it's Shavuot. On Shavuot, you're not allowed to mourn. He goes home, he makes Kiddush, as if nothing had happened. He goes to shul, as is the wont of pious Jews on the night of Shavuot. He sits down to read the Minyan HaMitzvot, the enumeration of the commandments by Shlomo ibn Gabirol, medieval poet, whom Agnon claims to be very attracted to because he was somebody who wrote both religious poetry and secular poetry. While he is taking up this vigil, he loses his self-control. He starts crying. An old man comes to him, who obviously a vision of Ibn Gabirol. And in a story, Ibn Gabirol composes a poem that incorporates the names of every single person in Buchach. Agnon comes to. He has forgotten the poem, but he is somehow comforted by the idea that all of his dead compatriots are commemorated. There are two things that we can learn from the story. One is that halacha very often requires a restraint that is almost superhuman. If it's a holiday, you have to rejoice no matter how you feel. And that has a correlate outside of the halachic realm as well. If we want to continue our lives, there's an element of suppression that takes place. We cannot be in mourning constantly. We have to move ahead with our lives. Not everybody can do it, but that's what we're obligated to do. The second lesson is memory, the importance of recognizing that every single person is an individual in the eyes of God. When we no longer remember their name, we no longer remember anything about them. People who are members of my family, I know their names, I know some stories about them. People who are not, I know that there were such people. I may even know some of their names. And the same is true for many of you. Nevertheless, we remember, even though we have very little to take hold of in terms of concrete memories. My grandfather, as Jonathan mentioned before, was in the United States at one time. He went back to Europe. Part of the reason I'm given to understand was that he thought that there was no future to religious Jewish life in the United States. And many of his children escaped. Finally, he and his wife applied for visas. The visas arrived too late to be of any use. And over the years, you have these people, again, I know what they looked like. I know that up to an age, I looked exactly like my grandfather. In the last photograph, as the nature of passport photographs did not come out that well, and he looked distraught, and probably he was distraught at that point. But I've had conversations with him. Past 50 years, I've spent most of my time teaching Torah in a yeshiva. And I wonder what would my grandfather have made of what I did with my life. Outside of my teaching yeshiva, I'm involved in religious American intellectual life, which is something that I cannot imagine any of our relatives in kind of conceiving of somebody who's an Orthodox rabbi who would be involved with the outside world at that level. Again, I wonder what would he have made of that? These private, these secret conversations. And I think of other people whom I know even less. And I go back to that first point that I drew out of Adnon's story. One of the most remarkable things of the generation that survives was that they built lives for themselves. I used to see Shiva, graduation time, students graduating, the parents and the grandparents coming and taking joy in the graduation, at the same time knowing that these people had a past, and that if they had been completely broken under that past, it would have been perfectly understandable. And you think of those people who were not at these graduations, who were killed 80 years ago and 77 years ago. And you think, what did they contribute to what the next generation and generations afterwards made of themselves? A friend of mine often refers to our generation as a generation without grandparents. But in a way, those grandparents were not completely absent. They left something behind. And there's something that most of us, all of us, have digested at some level. I think that is part of the reason that those who are here, those who are not here, invest so much in emotionally in maintaining a connection to people that we have not met, to people whose lives are very distant from the lives we lead, people whose lives, at least in my mind, were lived in black and white, even though I've seen photographs of the more modern Kanczuga. Hashem Yikom Damam, and may their memory continue to live and to inspire us.
Thank you. One of the people who successfully rebuilt his life was Ira Rosen, Leo Rosen. Ira's with us, his son. Ira, if you don't have the book and can find it.
I have it right here.
I keep saying Ira, I mean your father. Leo, if you don't have his book and you can find it, it's called Hidden. I refer to it frequently. Ira, you're here to share some of the words of one of the people who rebuilt, not just one people, your father and your aunt, who rebuilt their lives.
So my father and my aunt, Faye, grew up in the town, and their entire family was murdered, on this day. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about what happened. Not so much what happened, but the choices people made that day. And my father was a hidden Jew. He was hidden by the Kanczuga family. And there was a choice that people made that day. They had the ability to commit crime, including murder, without consequence, without fear of being arrested. But at the same time, others had the ability to hide Jews, and they were risking their family and their children in order to hide a Jew. So here was this morality play that was played out on this day 80 years ago. To commit crime, knowing that you could commit a crime and get away with it, or to hide another person who you barely know, but you're risking your family to do that. And as a result of the decision that the Kanczuga family made, I'm talking to you today because my father survived. And he survived, and with his sister Faye, who survived by her wits, roaming the fields for years in Poland, they wrote a book. I'm not trying to sell the book, but it's a remarkable book called Hidden that they co-wrote with Karen Neely, who's a fantastic professor in Florida. And what I'd like to do is just read the prologue and to bring you back to that day 80 years ago. And the way the book is written, it's a voice. One time it's a Leo's story, another time it's Faye's story. And so let me begin. We were hidden in the countryside by the time the war flooded streets of tiny Kanczuga, until screams and bursts of gunfire were as familiar as the cries of the peddlers hawking their wares in the Rheineck, the town's main marketplace. More than 100 of our people were executed at point-blank range in front of the Brill's house. Then early one morning, 2 young SS men, ably aided by the Polish police, rounded up the hundreds of Jews who had not managed to hide themselves in time. The officers deposited them in the main square, where they stood in shocked silence, some of them still in nightclothes, shivering in the sparkling dawn. Now the police herded their prisoners past the jeering crowds and onto the synagogue. Our people struggled to stare straight ahead, but as they drudged the tiny, dusty streets, they found themselves peering into the faces they had known all their lives, into the flat features and the pale eyes of their closest neighbors, empty and cold as death. Kanczuga's newest synagogue was a good quarter-mile from the Jewish cemetery on the edge of town. It was not quite completed, but already it was the pride of our community, a spacious sanctuary large enough to seat several hundred. That Shabbos, every inch of the shul was filled for the first time. Yet it was eerily quiet, the low murmurs punctuated only by the occasional barking of a policeman. Our family, apart from the 2 of us in hiding, filled the floors of the eastern wall. Tata's brother David sat with his wife and 3 of their 5 children, Aaron, Rooney, and little Golda, named after our grandmother. The other 2 children had been on vacation with their mother's parents and had already been captured and sent to Siberia. Wordless and watchful, our Tata fingered a pocket of his long black coat and stroked his beard. Besides him, Mama, her face raw from weeping, rested a delicate hand on one of my sister's shoulders. Now and then she whispered a little Tunya, who was serious even in the best of times. The child's face, olive-skinned as gypsies, glistened with tears. Pretty Zenya, Iranian blonde and almost a teenager, seemed out of place in this group of frightened Jews. She scanned the wan faces, searching for friends from school. With so many bodies huddled together, the room was close with the odor of human flesh. People slept standing straight as sentries, others twisted in unnatural positions on the floor. At some point, rain tapped, a somber staccato on the roof and the windows. A poor tradesman's reverential and cowering broke off from the crowd to consult with Tata. Do you think they'll deport us instead of killing us? Maybe send us away and spare our lives, God willing. Our taciturn father struggled and shook his head. Who's to say? He asked. I've heard that families who didn't come to the square to be picked up were shot in their homes. We can only wait and put our faith in God. God will provide us. God has never forsaken us. Like everyone else, my parents had come to the shul without packing a bag. But my best friend, Brucha Laufer, whose family had been temporarily spared because they were engineers still useful to the Reich, visited every day with supplies. That Friday morning, she brought 2 white Shabbos candles. The crowded room was hushed now, and Mama lit the trembled flames. For a moment, her face was illuminated as if from within. When she sang the Brucha, her shimmering soprano could scarcely be heard, so quickly did it make its way to God. Baruch atah Hashem, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'hadlik ner shel Shabbos. Shabbos morning arrived warm and bright, but the synagogue was musky with fear. Several men along began to daven, and Tata joined them in prayer, swayed back and forth to the familiar chants. Mama, as a woman forbidden to pray with the men, humming the wailing under the breath, her voice sweet and smooth as her homemade jam, her pitch never wavering. The men were still praying when the police ordered them to leave their families and trek to the short distance up the hill to the cemetery. Mama gripped the girls harder, her fingers digging so deeply into their flesh that they squirmed, but they did not break. Our father never a demonstrative man, reached for our mother's hand. The gesture was so unexpected that she met his eyes with a smile. Then the butt of an unseen rifle knocked Tata squarely between the shoulder blades, and he flinched and moved on without speaking. They traveled a short distance in wagons. A boy named Yankel jumped out of his wagon and disappeared into the woods before the policeman could fire. Then men were ordered out of the wagons. Perhaps the thought of Yankel gave the men strength as they climbed into a thin, halting line along the muddy path that wove through a cornfield. They passed a scarecrow mocking an unfettered repose. At the crest of the hill was the tree-lined cemetery as tombstones swayed in every row of shrubbery. As if on command, the men paused to catch their breath and wipe their brows. They gazed out over the crest of the hill to the patchwork of fields below. For a moment, they forgot their terror and shook their heads at the lush landscape. It could not be helped. They loved this country. A straight-back officer handed out shovels and told them to dig. "Keep digging," he said. "We'll tell you when you're finished." Most of the men were spindly and weak, with soft palms, more used to the Hebrew sitter than this spade. "Dig, keep digging. Thought you could get away with something, huh? Thought you could hide from us, you filthy Jews." When at last they were allowed to stop, the men stood in silence beside the freshly dug earth, their face slick with tears and sweat, and they stared at the raised rifles in astonishment, at eyes opaque as marbles that didn't look back. Then they saw the other eyes, those of their neighbors, the customers in their shops, the people to whom they had just last week sold a loaf of bread, who gave them a good price on chicken and eggs. The goyim stood or sat on their hunches in unruly rows alongside the policemen. Whole families with baskets of cheese and bread and homemade wine, little ones scurrying along the fringes of the crowd, hunting down field mice. The chattering spectators were in the edge, festive mood, the women's head bobbing in their colorful scarves. "Jew, out with the Jews," they said. The policemen raised their rifles. 100 hearts were broken before a single shot was fired. When it was over, the audience applauded and cheered. The next day, the sunlight was so fierce that the women shielded their eyes when they were led outside. They climbed through the tall grass directly to the pit, as if they had done so many times before, their children sobbing at their skirts. A fetid smell they did not recognize reached their nostrils, and they covered their faces in horror. When the policemen loaded their rifles, Xenia clutched Mama's waist. "I don't want to die," she cried. "The sun is shining so brightly, and I'm so young. I want to grow up in this beautiful world." For the first time in Xenia's life, our Mama could do nothing to help. She could not hold her any closer. She could not love her any more. One policeman who witnessed the scene was so moved that later he would recall Xenia to the Gwazniaks who had worked for us back in the town. Then a bullet shattered our little sister's face, and she collapsed in Mama's feet, spraying blood on her new white shoes. Next, Tunya dropped onto Xenia, her breath a shallow purr. Even before the third shot was fired, a mother fell on both of them, trying to protect what no longer was hers. Besides the gunmen, the onlookers, some of whom had tied handkerchiefs over their noses to stave off the scent, clapped and shouted their approval. A burst of laughter skimmed the crowd. Neighbors clapping each other on the back, not quite meeting each other's gaze. My brother and I were not present at our family's murder. What we know of it, we know from others, but we have lived it every day for half a century.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I've referenced that many times. There's one other book that I know of recounting Jewish life in Kanczuga, which is written by Yehuda Ehrlich. I see his daughter Nava is here, or was. I'm trying to bring her on so she can share a few words if she's here. But in the interim, I'm going to ask Cheryl Sandler to unmute. And there's a segment, Yehuda's book was written in Hebrew. There's a section I worked on with my daughter Noah to translate about a year and a half ago, that we like to share now about a segment of Yehuda's life. And if Nava's here, we'll ask that she join and speak afterward.
Do you want me to read the whole thing?
Yes, please.
Okay. Seder night, 1945. Pesach was approaching, and the survivors who remained in Kanczuga decided to make the Seder together. The Seder is one of my most painful memories. We gathered in the Kramberg's house, 15 men and a single woman, each one remembering his family and the Seders they had shared together in the past. Now we were merged in a kind of strange new family. One of the men in our group was saved by a Polish woman who hid him. Moshe Rosenholz was 60. Before the war, he was a wealthy man. He had a business exporting eggs and a beautiful family. All 6 of his children were tall and handsome, a family of beautiful giants. How it happened that, from the whole family, only the father survived, I do not know. A few days...
תוכל לשבת לידי שאם אני אתקע.
Cheryl, you're muted. Somehow you got muted. Can you? Yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to continue? Somebody?
Yeah, please. Somehow it got cut off.
Let's see. A few days after my release and return to Kanczuga, someone came and told us that Moshe Rosenholz was sitting alone at the edge of the town, waiting for someone to come and take him to where we were all staying in those first days. We were told that he had trouble walking and needed help. I went with my friend Yankala. When I saw him, I was horrified. The man I remembered as the head of the family of beautiful giants stood before me looking shockingly shabby. His hair had grown wild. He did not wear a shirt, but a vest. He was the picture of a poor and miserable man. All my possessions in the world were 10 zloty. We took him to a barber who cut his hair and shaved him for this amount. Over the next few weeks, he recovered and gained human form again. On the first night of the Seder, dressed in fine clothes, he sat at the head of the table as the eldest among us. How he managed to survive those few months, I do not know. His recovery was a miraculous wonder. This Seder was different than those celebrated by our families in the past. One of the survivors, Azriel Reisfeld, knew how to play the violin. We all enjoyed his music that night, bringing many to tears. I often recall the Seder as one of a kind. I came to the Seder from Zorworks. The next day, I returned to my office with the police. That night, I went to sleep early, but soon the deputy commander woke me with terrible news. The Jews of Kanczuga had been murdered. I didn't know how many were murdered. I didn't know who or how. It was a terrible night for me. I prepared to go back to Kanczuga in the morning, armed. I did not feel any support from the commander of the police, nor from any others. In the morning, I called the police chief in Kanczuga and told him I was coming with a group of policemen and asked for his help. I took a weapon and a few officers from our squad and set out to Kanczuga. I discovered that 6 Jews who had been staying in 2 houses had been killed that night. Kanczuga suddenly filled with swarms of Poles arriving from the surrounding villages, filling the town square. I don't know why they came, perhaps purely out of curiosity. However, I felt no empathy from them. Then we were faced with the matter of burial. According to Jewish law, we needed to bury our neighbors in a Jewish cemetery. However, the Jewish cemetery, about 2 kilometers away, we were hesitant because we had heard rumors and feared that there were plans to attack us en route. The sight in both places of the murder was terrible. Things were scattered all over the floor next to the victims. Everything was destroyed. It was like a scene from a pogrom against the Jews, pictures of which appeared in the papers in the past. There were 2 detectives from the investigations department of some government agency, but they weren't sympathetic at all. Their report was very technical, referring to the form of the murder, the entry and exit points of the bullets from the bodies. They prohibited me from photographing the victims and the horrible scenes. After much consideration, we decided to bury the 6 victims in the Krieger family's grove, where 3 of our friends were killed, including 2 daughters and last survivors of the Krieger family. We dug a big pit and buried the dead in the communal grave. Afterwards, my clothes were soaked in blood. Later, one of our officers told me that they had a suspect. I do not remember what the premise for this man's involvement in the murder was. However, the officer told me of a well-known Pole from the town who was one of the suspected murderers. While in town, I spotted the man in a crowd in the market and decided to arrest him. It must have been a strange sight. Me, a small Jewish boy, leading this large Polish man by gunpoint, with hundreds of Poles surrounding us, watching. Where I got the courage to do this, I do not know. It was clear that we could not leave a single Jew in Kanczuga. It was no longer safe. And so we all left, the remaining Jews, the police officers, and the prisoner. We left Kanczuga by wagon and made our way to Sorwask. After arriving in Sorwask, I helped the survivors settled into the rooms of my fellow officers in the police building. The next day, the family of the murder suspect arrived and attempted to pressure me into releasing him. Among them was the suspect's cousin, who happened to be a police officer in a nearby town. The family had engaged him to help pressure to release his cousin. He sat before me with a gun in his hand, clearly intended as a threat towards me. I stood my ground and did not allow them to affect me, but unfortunately it was pointless. My commander released the suspect after the latter signed a form committing to cooperate with the government, quite a common method in those days. We never discovered the true identity of the murderers. I believe that it was Poles who had stolen Jewish property and claimed it as their own. Having Jewish survivors living close by threatened them and their newly claimed property. However, this is only my assumption, one that I cannot prove.
Thank you, Cheryl. Nava, if you would please unmute yourself. I hope we did justice to translating your father's words to English. We'd love to hear if you have anything that you'd like to add, but we just need you to unmute. No, we don't hear you yet. You're still muted, Nava. There we go.
Okay. I'm not going to read the book because most of the people, they are talking English and the book is written, he wrote the book in Hebrew. I want to tell you that my father is more than 97 years old. He is the only one from Kanczuga that is still alive. It's not easy for him. All the time he's talking about the Holocaust, what happened to the Jewish people, and it's very difficult for him now. He told me about the killer of the 6 people after the war, when the Polish people came at night and they killed them during the night, and he said that it was awful. Only his sister and him, they were left from those years. And that's, when he was young, he loves the Kanczuga. He said that it was a very good place to live. He talked about going to the Cheder. He was 3 years old when he went to the Cheder. And when they were 6, they have to go in the morning to the a public school, and after that to go to the Cheder. And they love the life in Kanczuga. Most of the Jewish people in Kanczuga, they have shops, little shops. That he told me. And he was a hidden boy. After 2 years that the wars start, he was with Wolf Kramberg, I know, and Benny, I don't remember his...
Schanzer.
Yeah, both of them, they went to United States. They want him to come with them, but he said that he will go only to Israel. And all the other family, they were killed during the war. That's I have to say. If somebody want his book, I can send his book. That's it. Thank you for allowed me to talk about my family, and I'm very glad that you met my brother and my father.
Yeah, well, please send your father our love. And before he died, David and I spoke. He put the responsibility on me to translate his book to English. I have the PDF in Hebrew. We didn't get very far, just the segment that Cheryl translated, but hopefully one day soon we'll be able to we'll still be able to translate it. Thank you, Nava.
Yeah, it was a very big tragedy when my brother died. Yeah.
Yes. We're gonna move on with a couple of announcements because I want this to end properly. We've spoken about translating as a few action items, and Michael Freund and I were putting together the program and trying to think of how we could make this most meaningful and appropriate. We both agreed that we needed action items. First of all, Rabbi Carmi, you spoke about remembering people's names. One thing that I felt since we lived in America 20 years ago, it's so important. We've been as high as 73, 4 or 5 people on this. We had nearly 100 registered. It's quite an extraordinary representation from descendants of the Jewish community from all over the world. I think we're on 3 continents right now. And one of my dreams is that we can put together a community family tree and see if we can get back up to the, 967, 1,000 mark. I believe that we have that. I believe that our parents, our grandparents who survived, our children and grandchildren, and perhaps some of you great-grandchildren, I'd like to see that as a point of action. To the credit of Philip Traring, who is here with us, he's established Kanczuga.org as a great resource that we'd like to help build up. So I'm going to ask everybody that for the time being, we'll provide a link, but send pictures, documents, your own family trees, your names and relatives' contact information. I don't know about everyone else, but to me, it's quite emotional to have everybody together here. I don't think this has happened since perhaps the 50th anniversary celebration of the Kanczuga Society in the 1950s. I would love to find the resources and time and anyone's help to translate Yehuda's book segment by segment. And I've set up, which will send a link to everybody afterward, a page through which people can make a donation. I don't know that any of us are going to Kanczuga so soon, and that we're going to spend time cleaning up the cemetery. But as I mentioned, to Patrick's credit and that of others who have been involved, so it's a minimum responsibility that we all have. And through my nonprofit, we're establishing a fund to which you and others can contribute, and I invite that. with that, we're going to conclude inviting Ora Weinbach and Rabbi Elchanan Weinbach to conclude. Ora just came back from Poland. Any comments? And then El Malei Rachamim in English and in Hebrew. And we'll conclude with Hatikva. Ora?
Thank you. Thank you so much for putting this together. I am in a minute going to read the English of the El Malei Rachamim prayer for the victims of the Shoah. And followed by my father, who will read it and recite it in Hebrew. And I'm just struck by the fact that the last time I said this, I was in Kanczuga. 2 months ago, I was based in Krakow, and looked at a map and was like, if not now, when? And rented a car and just drove to Kanczuga, and was so fortunate, call it luck, call it God, that it just so happened to be that Patrick was there in Kanczuga that week visiting his family. And Patrick took me around and showed me the town and brought me to the cemetery and to the site of the mass grave, which is the picture here. And I just first of all want to express my profound gratitude to Patrick for opening his heart up to all of our stories and taking responsibility in a way that is above and beyond what is expected and almost understandable. So I really feel very grateful to him. And I'll just share that when I went to the cemetery, part of me wanted to look and find my grandfather's kever, his gravesite. My grandfather's grandfather was Rav Shimon Yeshaya Reich. And I wanted to look for that stone. And then I had a moment of realization, which is that there's all these other graves here and all these other gravestones and all these other people who've been buried here who probably nobody's coming to look, or very few people, very rarely, very far between are coming to see them, and how many of them probably don't even have descendants who are alive anymore. And instead of looking for my grandfather's grave, I paused and I prayed, I davened, as if everybody in the cemetery was my family. And I feel that way. I feel blessed to be on this call with all of you. I feel that we have a familial tie and relationship. And I hope that it brings comfort to anybody here who has ancestors who are buried in that cemetery and in this mass grave, that just 2 months ago I was there and I davened for them like they were mine. And it's with that intention that I'm going to daven, to pray this El Malei Rachamim now, and then turn it over to my father. O God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant perfect rest in your divine presence to all the souls of our holy and pure brethren, whose blood was spilled by the murderers in Auschwitz, Belzec, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and other extermination camps across Europe, and in Kanczuga, and all the Jewish communities throughout Europe who were killed, strangled, burned, and buried alive for the sanctification of your name, for whose souls we now pray. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. May you, Master of Mercy, shelter them in the shadow of your wings for eternity. And may you bind their souls in the bonds of life. Hashem, you are their heritage, and may they repose in peace in their resting places. And now let us say, Amen.
I'd like to begin by thanking everybody who's been involved in putting this together, Jonathan and everyone else who's been involved in putting this together. I'm momentarily going to recite the same prayer my daughter recited in English. I'm going to recite it in Hebrew. And I hope to recite it with the same devotion that I always saw from my father. My father learned to daven at the feet of his Zeta, Shimon Shaya Reich in Kanczuga. My father was outside, the outside wrappings were American and the inside wrapping was all Kanczuga inside. So listen, I don't know if I don't know what my father was thinking about when he davened, but he sure knew what devotion was and he didn't get distracted. He knew how to daven and he knew how to daven from Kanczuga. So while my Torah is certainly not directly from Kanczuga, except for Rabbi Carmi, thank you. And while my Torah is not from there and my background in education is not from there, my devotion, I suspect, is. And for that gift, I remain thankful. I remember my father today, who grew up in Kanczuga and left before the war. His passport on December 25th, 1938 has a giant swastika on it. Wow. Fortunately, he got out beforehand. Unfortunately, much of his family did not, and I just want to take a moment to mention some names of some of the people who were lost in keeping with what was done, and then I'll recite the Kel Mole. I just need a moment here to find here it is, the list of names. The Hebrew date on the top of the card is written by my father as the 18th of Av. That is the Jewish date of the passing of all of these people. Hadassah Bas Baruch, Rachel Bas Rav Shimon Yeshaya, his aunt, Chava Perel Bas Shimon Yeshaya, his aunt, Rav Pinchas ben Moshe, his uncle, Alta Shendel Bas Rav Pinchas, and Shimon Yeshaya, who was named after my Alta Zeta, Shimon Yeshaya ben Harav Pinchas, Zichronam Levracha, may their names be a blessing for all of us. El Molech Rachamim Shochein B'Meroimim Hamseh Minucha Nechona Kanfei Hashechina B'Malos Kedoshim Utorim Kizora Kia Mazhirin Eskol HaNishamo Shel Shisha Milyonei Yehudim Chalulei HaShoah B'Europa Shenehergu, Shenishchatu, Shenisrafu, Shenispu Al Kiddush Hashem. B'nei Amaratzim, Agemonim, Hanatzim, V'Ozreim Mishar Ho'amim. Lochem Balrachamim. Yastireim B'Seiskenofov Li'olamim. V'Yitzror B'Tzror Chayim Es Nishmoseihem. Adonai Unachalosam. B'Gan Eden Tehei Menuchosam. V'Amdu L'Golam L'Ketz Hayamin V'Nomar. Amen.
Amen. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Let's not make this the last time, and let us have the occasion to come together and celebrate good things as an extended community.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.